Now, for months, Nigerians have been told the economy is stabilizing. The naira has steadied somewhat, foreign reserves improved, investor confidence appeared to return. Government officials point to reform gains and insist the worst may finally be behind us. But is Nigeria genuinely recovering, or are we merely stabilizing on top of a dangerous economic fault line? Because beneath the headline numbers lies another story, one of mounting debt, ballooning deficits, slowing productivity, rising borrowing, and growing fears that the government may already be losing control of the fiscal side of the economy. My guest tonight, Tilewa Adebajo, CEO of CFG Advisory, has released a deeply sobering assessment of Nigeria's economic outlook. His report warns that while the country may have exited crisis stabilization, it has not achieved transformation. He points to a staggering 35 trillion naira budget deficit with no clear financing plan, debt service ratios heading dangerously towards 90%, and an economy increasingly squeezed by global shocks, from trade wars to tensions in the Strait of Hormuz. The result? Petrol prices up 50%, diesel up 85%, aviation fuel up more than 100%, inflation surging again after months of decline. And perhaps most ominously, he warns that Nigeria's reform credibility now rests not on announcements but on execution. So, are the reforms truly working, or is Nigeria entering a far more dangerous economic phase where stabilization without growth becomes politically and socially unsustainable? Well, for more on this, I'm joined now on the line from our studios in Lagos by one of Nigeria's top economists, Tilewa Adebajo, the CEO of CFG Advisory. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, your report says Nigeria is stabilized but not transformed. In plain terms, what does that actually mean?
Well, we're not growing, Charles, and good evening to you, and thanks for that introduction. The Nigerian economy supports 200 million people, and if 200 million people are to benefit from this economy, the economy has to be growing at 8 to 10% on a sustainable basis. The potential of the Nigerian economy is not in doubt. It's just a question of the drivers of the economy and the structural problems that are inherent within this economy, that we're always in stabilization or fixing mode instead of consistently having a growth strategy that can bring benefits to 200 million Nigerians. We have 140 million Nigerians in poverty, and for those Nigerians to feel the impact of this economy, our economy needs to be growing at least by 8 to 10% on a consistent basis. And of course, we also need to be able to drop inflation to be able to restore purchasing power so that we can improve consumer demand and aggregate demand.
Well, I mean, I wonder what your thoughts are then on the reforms that have been taking place. Because, I mean, you said in your report that credibility now depends on execution rather than announcements. And I wonder if the government, in your view, is losing credibility on execution.
Well, this year will tell. We've had 2 years of aggressive reforms, and we're now in the first quarter of the year. The National Bureau of Statistics has not yet released the GDP numbers, so we had to extrapolate the Purchasing Managers Index from the central bank to be able to come up with an idea of what the growth numbers would be like in the first quarter. And unfortunately, they don't look too good because despite we've had like about 10 consecutive months whereby the PMI has stabilized at over 50%, 54%, but right now it's on the decline. So that is a source of concern. Another source of concern for us is the fact that you could see that the impact of the oil prices and the Gulf War crisis has already landed in Nigeria. Inflation that has witnessed 12 consecutive months of decline has grown by 4.2% in the last month. And we expect that inflation will begin to rise from another about 15%, probably by the end of the year if this persists, as the pass-through effects of these cost-push inflationary issues come through by the end of the year. We could see inflation heading towards 20%.
And I mean, your report also paints a deeply worrying picture of Nigeria's debt trajectory. Are we approaching a debt trap?
There's a debt trap, and there's sustainability. The concern for me about the rising debt profile of Nigeria is the fact that a lot of the financing of the sort of debt we're using now, going to commercial banks abroad, borrowing money, and then over collateralizing them with local securities, and using them to fund recurrent expenditure and projects that cannot pay them back are of particular concern, because we're using that financing for the wrong things. And eventually the consequences are going to be quite severe concerning the amount we see. Another concern I have is the fact that this year alone, we have borrowed between January and April about 8 trillion naira from the domestic debt market. That was that money we borrowed was like 80% of what we borrowed the whole of last year, which was 10 trillion. So at the rate we're going now, we're tending to go to about close to over 24 trillion from the domestic market. And that for me is a red flag, because the budget itself, with a 35 trillion deficit, is putting significant pressure on the financing of government. And we haven't really seen the financing plan for this deficit. Now, on the brighter side, NNPC over the last 2 months has been remitting about 2 trillion a month. After the president signed the executive order. But at the end of the day, we are not really seeing the sustainability between the revenues and the debts. There's a significant mismatch. And we're looking for that financing plan, and we still haven't seen that. So that is a concern on domestic debt. So by the end of this year, domestic debt could be close to 100 trillion. And in the last 4 or 5 years, domestic debt has quadrupled. And, right now, I think we are getting to unsustainability levels.
Right. I think I know the problem you're going through there, Tilewa, and apologies. I think you're probably hearing yourself back in your ear. And that happens sometimes when the microphone pots are simultaneously open. But don't worry, we're not hearing that hurl around. It's not happening in the studio. We can hear you loud and clear. So just talk as freely and as normally as you would, and ignore that repetition in your ear. I apologize for that. But I mean, you warn that Nigeria has entered what you call a high-frequency borrowing model, and that, I mean, it almost looks as if the government is becoming addicted to debt. And you talk about how dangerous that is, that long-term borrowing is increasingly being used to fund recurrent expenditure rather than productive infrastructure. But government officials are pointing to macroeconomic indicators. In your assessment, for citizens, the economy is essentially measured at petrol stations, markets, and pharmacies, isn't it? Are those reforms failing to translate into real-life relief?
Yes, indeed. And I think that's really where the challenge is, because the most important thing for Nigerians right now is the purchasing power capacity. Because of inflation, inflation has eroded our purchasing power significantly. And, we'd had this disinflation over the last 15 months. But unfortunately, that is ending now, and that is causing some problems because Nigerians were expecting before this crisis that inflation might be single digit this year, but that is not going to be the case. So that problem persists. So what we need now is to take a look at the structural reforms that the government needs to put in place to consistently grow the economy. And it's not by borrowing, because the debt service this year alone is about maybe 16 trillion naira, which is more than the defense, health, education, and infrastructure budget combined. So that is a big challenge. The debt to revenue ratio, which reduced significantly, is going back up. So if you have a situation whereby 80 to 90% of your revenues are being used towards debt service, you don't really have much left to be able to make investments to grow strategies. And the problem, is that the government has not been able to fund its capital budget for the last 3 years. And these are structural issues that we need to address. And you can no longer continue to sustain high interest rates, because at a point in time, there's going to be a need for a compromise.
And I mean, for people who don't understand economics as well as you do, the ordinary Joe blogs on the street, I mean, Nigeria is an oil-producing country, yet global tensions always seem to hurt it more than help it. I mean, how did Nigeria end up in that paradoxical position?
Well, the reason why we're here today in this position is that we have not created the buffers to be able to assist us with global shocks as an oil-producing nation. During the global crisis in 2018-2019, Nigeria had excess crude of about $25 billion. And that money was the money that helped us to cushion the impact of that crisis. Now, at that point in time, a case was made for us to, to invest this money. But Governors Amechi and Governor Fashola went to court to challenge that decision that they needed to share that money. Well, today, unfortunately, the excess crude account is less than 100,000. And a sovereign wealth fund that is supposed to create this buffer for us has maybe less than $100 million in the stabilization fund to be able to help fund deficits. So we understand we're an oil-producing nation. And to make matters worse, our oil production, which is at 1.5 million barrels, is not sufficient. Nigeria was producing 1.5 million barrels in 1971. By 1977, Nigeria hit 2.5 million barrels of oil production a day. Today, since 1977, we've not exceeded 2.5 million barrels. But luckily, I think now, with the reforms in the oil and gas sector, the oil and gas sector is set for some significant growth because there's about $18 billion of committed funding that will go into the oil industry this year, and the rig counts have improved significantly. But the underinvestment for those years is what is causing the problem. And to also exacerbate those situations, we had sold oil forwards. So this windfall of $100 prices that we should have at this point in time, maybe we're only benefiting about 10 to 15%, and we can't have 100 because we don't have the barrels to be able to enjoy that. So we find ourselves in a situation whereby the consistency in policy formulation is beginning to catch up with us. After 2 years of aggressive reforms, then people are going to begin to expect some sort of relief. Interest rates at these levels is to support inflation. But there's a compromise because we have to reduce interest rates so that people can borrow to invest in the economy. So that is a big challenge. And if you don't have low interest rates and the government is borrowing and crowding out the private sector, then you're going to have a challenge. Eventually, you're going to have some growth is not going to be an issue, and you find yourself might return to a situation of stagflation.
That's a very good point. And
so structural reforms.
Yes, that's a very good point and a very important one that you make. And we're fast running out of time. Really interesting to talk with you. So I'm going to ask you a double-barreled question, which I don't usually like to do, but I know you're smart enough to answer both. You suggest that elections next year may already be affecting economic discipline. And my question is, has politics begun to overtake reform? And the second one is, what signal did the removal or resignation of Wale Edu as Minister of the Economy and Finance Minister send to investors and markets?
Well, I think that just signals a change in direction of policy, which is yet to be articulated. So by the time you make those sort of changes at that level with your finance minister and coordinating minister of the economy, then you're signaling a different direction. As you see from the earlier part of your program, it was all about political discussions. So right now, politics has taken the front seat in Nigeria, and the concern we have is that the government should not take its eye off the ball, because this is a very critical year when it comes to consolidating the gains of the reforms. There have been gains on these reforms, and this is a critical period. So government really needs to put in place growth strategies to be able to consolidate on the reforms. If they don't, as the headlines of our report has said, economic reform gains are under threat if the government does not put the right policies in place to sustain them.
Now, you said that Q2 to Q4 of 2026 will be decisive. What are the specific warning signs Nigerians should now watch closely?
Inflation and the rising debt profile of government. That can threaten exchange rate stability.
Right. And are you optimistic that Nigeria can still turn this stabilization into real transformation?
If they implement the policies, as we've said, it's no longer about talking. It's all about execution.
Right. And you just very briefly, because we're almost out of time, you point out that forward oil contracts limit Nigeria's ability to benefit from higher crude prices. Just explain that briefly before we have to go.
Well, basically, the oil that you have, we've sold them and we've collected the money for our production over the next 2 to 3 years. So the revenue you should have earned over the next 2 or 3 years, you've collected that and you've spent it. So it's no longer available. So that revenue is no longer available for you. So you have to look at alternative sources of revenue. And that is why we're borrowing to fund recurrent expenditure.
So basically, policymakers have effectively mortgaged tomorrow's oil revenues to solve today's problems.
Exactly.
Well, on that rather depressing note, I want to thank you very much indeed. It's always a pleasure to talk with you and to get the benefit of your very objective analysis of the Nigerian economy. Tilewa Adebajo is CEO of CFG Advisory and is one of Nigeria's top economists, and he was talking to me from our studios in Lagos. Thank you very much indeed. That's it for this edition of Arise Prime Time. Join us again tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja and Lagos. Bye-bye, and thank you for watching.